It was very much a mechanical answer to an electronics problem, because in the early days they basically looked at everything with an electromechanical view.
The concept of wireless was, in 1910, was still very, very new and novel.
It took the missionaries in every case to advocate for the local people, to complain against harsh treatment, to criticise corruption, to write letters to governments to change policy.
You put that energy through a spark gap and you threw an enormous amount of energy out into space. And then it was almost dumb luck as to whether that signal was received at the other end.
Wireless in those days was only operated through Morse code, and there was no broadcast wireless, there was no voice over wireless.
We shouldn't think about missionary orders then like we do now. These men were very practical people. They built industry, they built businesses, they harvested timber, they provided support to train local people.
When we look at Father Shaw and his life, and it was an extraordinary life, and he was an extraordinary character, but he was very human. While he had great ability and great strengths, he also had great flaws and weaknesses, and some of which led him into difficult situations.
She had affairs with a variety of different people, but there were none of them that were not exceptional. Every one of them was a mover and shaker of the times that she was associated with, and it was nice to know that she appreciated quality.
Setting up a factory and all that, it was a very public sort of thing, and when it all went, down the tube, it was out there. And one of the comments was that everybody hoped that Shaw and the factory and everything would just go away.
In 1910, Australia's first commercial wireless factory was founded in Randwick, on land behind this tram shelter. Known as the Maritime Wireless Telegraph Company, it manufactured spark gap wireless sets, a technology which predated broadcast radio by more than a decade. Wireless was different then. It involved point-to-point communication in Morse code only.
The piece of equipment we're going to look at today is a spark gap transmitter. It's a very primitive early transmitter that was built in the 1900s. Marconi painted a lot of the technologies around spark gap transmitters, and they ranged in size from the very small to absolutely massive half-kilowatt transmitters that were designed to send signals around the world. And the way a spark gap transmitter works, it's very similar to the coil and ignition in your everyday car, where you have a set of breaker points or contact points, and they activate a coil, which is the low side of the equation, and that coil then boosts the power to high voltage, and that high voltage then activates a spark. In this case, we use the spark and its RF component to transmit across the airwaves and be picked up by a crystal set or a radio receiver of some description. On the front here, you can see that there's a coil. What this coil actually is the coil to tune the transmitter for a specific frequency. So when we were talking about the RF frequency, that's the frequency that you tune your radio to on the dial. This allows you to tune the transmitter to that frequency. Most modern transmitters have a very, very specific frequency that they transmit on. So you tune the transmitter and you don't interfere with anybody else. Unfortunately, spark gap transmitters, being as primitive as they are, don't have that capability. So even though you're transmitting on a single frequency, there is a number of harmonics or other frequencies that it also transmits on simultaneously. You can actually change the contact distance on the contact points, and that changes the tone of the transmitter. So apart from trying to change your fundamental frequency, you could actually change the tone, so you could tell between transmitter 1 and transmitter 2. As for limiting the power is only limited by the size of the coil and the power supply that you're feeding it with. We know that in Germany and in Holland, they had massive rotary transmitters that could punch out 500,000 watts and go around the world on very low frequencies. And they used a massive alternator about the size of a 20-foot container to achieve that, and a big rotary quenched spark system to do so. So spark gap had a very limited use. It was Morse, so obviously there was no voice communications. And the other thing, it was used for either military communications, ship-to-shore communications, so emergencies for ships at that point in time. There were a lot of disasters, and you know, we know about the Titanic as a famous one. And Morse code was generally used for that type of communication. I'm just going to use a standard broadcast receiver. I'm going to flick it on. It's on a station. We'll turn it off a station because it doesn't really matter where we tune at this point in this proximity to the transmitter. Turn the volume up and you can hear what the signal would sound like on a radio.
In addition to wireless, the workshops at Randwick also operated as a versatile light engineering factory and filled a wide variety of contracts, including the manufacture of motors, generators and air compressors. The factory was known locally as the Wireless Works. It began as a simple affair in a modest corrugated iron workshop from an unlikely partnership between two friends: a Catholic priest, Archibald Shaw, and a manufacturing electrician, Edward Kirkby. The idea was born 6 years earlier, following an horrific massacre of missionaries in New Britain to Australia's north.
The Sacred Heart missionaries then went on to set up at St Paul, which is inland from the north coast of the Gazelle, their first industrial village. Now, these industrial villages were designed to be, if you like, models for the kind of peasant farmer future that they hoped Papua New Guineans, or New Guineans in this area, would have.
The entire staff of the St Paul mission, located in the Bining Mountains, were murdered. 2 priests, 3 religious brothers, and 5 missionary sisters, all from Europe. In the months that followed, countless natives were also killed in reprisal attacks under the order of the German administrator, whose government then controlled this region of New Guinea.
The missionaries were taken by surprise one morning, and they were shot and hacked to death with knives and axes in a most brutal way. The outcome of that, the consequence, was that government, troops and police, plus some vigilante groups, went through the Bonnie Mountains and more or less shot whoever they saw. In the minds of the people, that certainly would have impressed that the administration was in charge. But those things don't go away. People remember that. And they would sit in their houses and around their fires, and the stories would be told over and over again.
The Germans were usually quite good at using traditional methods of peace exchanges to make sure that peace was re-established. They would give some wealth to the local people. The local people would break their spears and create peace. And there would be a formal ceremony with a flag raising and shooting of guns in the air, so that everybody would be satisfied that a new relationship was being established between them and the colonial administration.
Many of the local leaders lost status and position because of the governance of the colony. The police, the army, took over many of the roles of chiefs and big men, and they felt isolated.
It was Father Shaw's order, the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart, who ran the St. Paul Mission, and Shaw in Sydney was their mission supplier, or procurator, at the time of the massacre in 1904.
The work of the procurator was obviously to procure whatever supplies were needed for the missions. And the place he did that was a procurer. And so he had to purchase whatever was needed in terms of food or other material goods, or even roofing iron, bits of machinery, tools, and so forth, and then to get them on a ship and send them up to wherever they were supposed to go.
Shaw had met each of the slain missionaries on previous visits and accompanied their replacements sent out from Europe to re-establish the St. Paul mission months later.
It was quite brave of those missionaries to come back, really, when they did in December. And Archibald Shaw was quite brave to bring them back. He was very lucky not to have been there in August. If he had been in August, he probably would have been a victim.
Shaw was to later claim that this massacre was the decisive event that made him look seriously at using wireless in the missions. He immediately saw the potential it offered. Wireless could serve as a means of keeping in touch with distant missionaries direct from Sydney. It could help keep them safe, and it could serve as a mechanism for them to expeditiously order materials, medicines, food, and so on, as was required. By way of recompense for the massacre, the German government handed over large tracts of plantation land to the missionaries, which was later sold and mostly used to service mission debt. Some of these funds were used by the order to purchase a large house known as Ascot at 4 Dewtruck Street, Randwick in 1910. It became the Mission Procure, or supply house, where orders were received by mail from the missions and goods were dispatched. It also served as a resting house, or sanatorium, for visiting missionaries, many of whom suffered from chronic tropical diseases and stayed in Sydney to recuperate for short periods. The house sat on a sizable block with idle land to the rear. Shaw built a workshop on the vacant land and rented it to his friend Edward Kirkby, from where he ran his own business. In an unusual arrangement, Kirkby and his sons also lived at Ascot.
Kirkby asked Shaw and Gee, could he build a factory on the land that they owned at the rear of their procure in Dewtruck Street, Randwick. And they wouldn't let Kirkby build the factory, but they built the factory and let it to Kirkby for £2 a week. I think it cost them £150. Yeah, and Kirkby moved in with his men and tools and equipment and began manufacturing his systems of fire protection.
Kirkby was a watchmaker and instrument maker. He worked with his sons selling patented fire alarms of his own design. He also made a wide variety of scientific instruments, including medical equipment such as X-ray machines, Finson lights, and induction coils. He recently moved his business from Melbourne and was looking for a place to manufacture in Sydney that had enough room to set up an antenna so he could continue experimenting with wireless, for which he had developed a profound interest.
Wireless for Kirkby was a hobby and an interest, and he really enjoyed demonstrating technology. He did the same with X-rays a decade before, and he was very connected within that amateur wireless community as well. So I think his interest wasn't a commercial one, whereas I think Archibald Shaw was certainly a commercial interest, both in terms of developing the business and growing its capital base.
Before studying for the priesthood, Shaw worked as a postal telegraphist. On a visit to Bathurst, he met with Joseph Slattery, also a priest, who taught at St Stanislaus College. Slattery pioneered diagnostic X-rays in Australia and for a brief time held the land distance record for spark wireless.
I had a knowledge of electricity and engineering before I entered the order and was determined to use my knowledge in the engineering line to create money for the procure.
At night, Kirkby and Shaw worked on wireless in the Randwick house.
After the first tests, Father Shaw needed to build the necessary instruments for new experiments and new improvements, but he didn't have a penny and not a lot of experience as a construction engineer. So he ended up with a young engineer-electrician who, out of love for science and friendship for Shaw, gave him 3 or 4 hours of his time every evening. Together they experiment, and they succeed beyond their expectations.
Given Kirkby's watchmaking background and instrument-making background, he was probably the perfect partner for Shaw to be able to design and manufacture some amateur wireless equipment.
Together with a young Englishman, Reg Wilkinson, and an American, Marion Mulroney, they soon developed a workable system with a reasonable range that could be sold into the growing maritime market, both naval and merchant, hence the name of the business they founded, Maritime Wireless.
I was working on wireless and had no tools to make the instruments I needed. I went to an electrical engineer, an old friend of mine, a Mr. Kirkby, who had a shop with his 3 sons. They were earning their living making electrical instruments. He too was working on wireless, but had no success or a place to put up an aerial. He said he'd gladly make up the instruments I needed if I would help him and let him work with me at night. I designed the instruments and he made them up.
What he realised was that, particularly with the rise of wireless telegraphy and a gap in the Australian market, here was an opportunity to take what was amateur experimentation around wireless telegraphy and build a commercial basis to that, and in the process actually helping the mission cash up.
In no time at all, success crowned our efforts. Kirkby then asked my consent to make up these instruments for public use, and if he sold any, I would get half the profit. He also asked us to rent him a corner of our land, and he would put up a shop and pay rent. Father Superior, Joseph Gee, and myself, finding that the shop was a simple affair and costing only £61 to build, decided to build it ourselves and get £2 a week rent for same.
Shaw hoped that his share of profits would be used to fund mission activities, for which there never seemed to be enough money. With an extended range, wireless might one day come into service in the missions.
Shaw was interested in wireless. He saw it as a means of communicating with his missions in the Pacific. And here he had Kirkby, who had been one of the earliest inventors, users of wireless in Australia. Here was this man, an expert in wireless telegraphy, building his fire protection equipment in the factory owned by Shaw.
Several large shipping disasters, culminating in the 1912 sinking of the Titanic, saw governments ratify rules for shipborne wireless, which increased the likelihood of success for the fledgling company. Soon, wireless sets were being produced and sold from the workshop. A large metal radio mast was constructed by the factory workers behind Ascot and came to symbolise the ascendancy of Maritime Wireless as a manufacturer. It was the tallest structure in Australia and probably the southern hemisphere at the time. The mast was funded by local donors to replace smaller, experimental timber structures that were destroyed in a storm. Around this time, Father Shaw applied for a transmitting licence from the Postmaster General's Department and was issued the call sign XPO. There was something very unusual about a priest being involved in a manufacturing industry, particularly one who had taken a vow of poverty. Shaw had always been a man of big ideas, and opinion remained divided amongst his fellow priests. However, when Maritime Wireless was founded, his motivation was altruistic. He had in mind the whole undertaking would benefit his order and their activities in the foreign missions. By the middle of 1911, Kirkby and his sons had severed their association with Maritime Wireless. Kirkby remained in business but went on to operate independently from an address in the city.
There's a couple of different views about why Kirkby left the wireless works. One was that it was becoming increasingly central in terms of commercial development, that Father Shaw was actually growing the capital base and it wasn't a direction commercially that Kirkby wanted to go in. The other driver was perhaps a more personal one because his wife had remained based in Melbourne for a very long period of time. She eventually relocated to Sydney, but she was very ill. And so one position is that he simply needed to step away from his involvement at the wireless works and concentrate on supporting his wife during what was really her final illness.
Back at Randwick, Shaw continued to gather around him a host of wireless experts, engineers and workers. The business continued to grow rapidly. Investors were not hard to find, and their cash made possible the construction of further workshops, the acquisition of machinery, and the purchase of an adjacent house, Archibald, at 49 Avoca Street, directly behind Ascot. Both Ascot and Archibald were used to house senior staff employed at the factory, and the whole site extended to about 2.5 acres. The expanding business underwent several recapitalisations to fund growth, and in a short time it became a sizable operation. It had frontages on Avoca Street, Dewtruck Street and Frenchman's Road in Randwick. The wireless works now included several workshops, a carpentry and pattern shop, a foundry, a punch press shop and tool room, power room, a generator assembly room, an armature winding room, a general machine shop and a laboratory. At its height, Maritime Wireless employed about 180 workers, including a large number of apprentices in carpentry, electrical and metal trades.
The company is looked upon by the Archbishop and priests of the diocese as a Catholic engineering college where the young men can be taught the sciences on their leaving school.
The business attracted young, talented engineers from around the world and became a sort of Silicon Valley for its era, a place where ideas became reality. It would have certainly been an exciting place to work. To protect shipping around Australia's vast coastline, a coastal wireless service had been talked about by the government for some time. The proposal developed into plans to build a network of 19 wireless stations spaced around Australia's perimeter. The system was designed by the Commonwealth's radio telegraph engineer Graham Balsillie. To the surprise of well-established manufacturers, Maritime Wireless won the contracts for the construction of 17 of these stations against its principal competitors, Telefunken and Marconi.
The period where the Wireless Works held the exclusive contract to manufacture the equipment for the Commonwealth Coastal Wireless Network was its wealthiest time.
One can only imagine the wrath of the great Marconi Company at being turned down in favour of an unknown Australian inventor. They immediately brought an action against the Commonwealth in the High Court for infringement of the patent rights.
Telefunken were represented in Australia by the Australian Wireless Company, and one of the principals in that was Hugh Dennison, who was also the chairman of the Sun newspaper of the day.
Not long afterward, Telefunken and Marconi merged to become a formidable force. They formed Amalgamated Wireless Australasia, familiarly known as AWA, and were a strong competitor against Maritime Wireless.
All along they hated and feared these works, and the opportunity to strike a blow at them came with the coming into office of the first National War government.
Through his business activities, Shaw had significant press exposure and became a well-known public figure. The newspapers of the time carried the stories of his exploits and adventures in wireless, and there were many. He was the figurehead and mouthpiece of Maritime Wireless, and had been since its inception.
He started to build the profile of his business in the public mind.
When the Deputy Administrator of British New Guinea, Miles Staniforth Smith, mounted an expedition into the interior and failed to return, it was Father Shaw who assembled a team of volunteer wireless operators to conduct a rescue mission. It was funded by his business and coordinated from a base station set up on Thursday Island. The rescuers searched up the multitude of rivers around the Deception Bay area of the Gulf of New Guinea, where the party of over 70 men had set out from. The expedition finally made its own way back to civilization, having been lost for months on a swashbuckling, ill-planned and fatal adventure to explore the rugged interior of New Guinea. For his efforts, Shaw garnered much publicity for wireless as a utility, and for Maritime Wireless, his business. The Wireless Works were also approached by Douglas Mawson to supply wireless for his South Pole expedition, scheduled to depart Australia at the end of 1911. However, he passed this over for a potentially more lucrative offer associated with the venture. If he was able to establish wireless contact with the Mawson expedition head in Antarctica from mainland Australia, he would be awarded profitable contracts for his Shaw system of wireless that the company patented and manufactured. The radio contact never occurred. Nothing was known of the issues wireless had to contend with when operating near the polar regions. In fact, reliable wireless contact with Antarctica was only successful some 2 years later. Despite positive stories in the press, there were storm clouds on the horizon. Maritime Wireless was growing physically faster than its income could support, and on many occasions Shaw found himself in the unenviable position of having to use mission funds to cover shortfalls in the Wireless Works accounts, just to keep the business viable. The diversion of mission funds to cover these short-term cash demands was always seen by Shaw as a temporary solution, but it proved to be a fatal error of judgment once discovered by his religious superiors.
Father Shaw was receiving the funding for the missions from Germany and from France, and had to account to those provinces for the money, for how he spent it, where it went. And I would guess that when Australia became a province and had its own provincial, that would have set up some tension between Father Shaw and the provincial.
His intention was to always pay back what was borrowed, but it often could not be done in a timely manner, and he had lost track of how much he actually owed. Being committed to several simultaneous business ventures didn't help either. He was the principal in a large sawmill and timber business near Wingham, a coal mine at Wallara North near Swansea, and a molybdenite mine at Deepwater. It was impossible for him to keep tabs on everything. Complicating matters, he was simultaneously fending off accusations of patent infringements from the litigious Marconi Company, one of his fiercest competitors. Father Shaw was also handicapped by a somewhat chaotic approach to bookkeeping. His office lacked order, and his paperwork was a mess. The bills and invoices for the missions and for Maritime Wireless should have been kept separate, but were instead mixed up together in a disorganised room in Ascot that served as the Mission Procure office. His superior at the time, Father Guy, expresses his frustration.
Do not think that there is anything fishy in the affairs of the Procure. Thank God, no. As far as my conscience and my poor skill allow me to know, everything is on a straight line. The only fault, a huge one, is that all the bills and almost all the bills and letters from merchants and bankers are addressed to Shaw, who in Sydney is the big Manitou for everything that concerns missions. The bills therefore arrive at his house, and that's it. They accumulate and get lost, mixed up in a sheaf of paperwork. Only he himself can make sense of it. It's a pandemonium unlike any other. When he gets money, he pays for everything, and there's order for a while. During his frequent absences, I take possession of all the letters myself, and I also do it when he is here, and not the first to meet the postman. But very often the postman arrives when I'm not here. In short, there are always some bills that do not reach me on time. They are not lost, but I only learn about them by going to discover his checkbooks and by collating them.
Father Shaw must have been the worst administrator of all time. The missions books and the factories books were two separate things, but they were all piled up on a desk somewhere in that complex. And sorting out what was just soul-destroying for Father Guy. He couldn't manage it at all, and Father Shaw wasn't any help. His administration skills were zero.
It was physically impossible for me to do the accounts because of the many bills that I could not discover. How many times I asked Father Shaw for them, each time it was a formal promise that it would be done. Then the wireless got him back into gear, and that was the end of the mission accounts. When I received your letter the other day, I read to him everything that concerned him. He recognized the work immediately. He said about it, I'm saying it, he started, then after an hour or two, blah blah blah. The telephone, the Commonwealth Minister wants to speak, then the Postmaster General. Then it's the Minister of War, then it's the Premier. Result, Shaw absolutely and immediately must leave, and I am no further ahead than before.
Guy tried as best he could to manage Archibald Shaw, but as the business grew, the wireless business grew, I think Guy's sense of it was that it was becoming increasingly out of control. And I think he regarded the finances as chaotic, and he wrote as much to the order.
Shaw's superiors in Europe were made aware of financial anomalies before 1914, but were forced to act swiftly when goods for the missions failed to arrive. They dispatched a senior priest, a German called Hubert Linkens, to audit the mission accounts.
A visit to the wireless works revealed a great industry of men working in a factory attached to the residence of the Procure. In this residence was the office of the Procure and for the wireless works. But the office was an untidy mess, and it meant that before any documents could be found, I myself had to spend 2 days putting the office in order.
Linkens was forensic in his attention to detail. Within a few days of arriving in Sydney, he accused Shaw of embezzling mission funds. The scale of the missing money ballooned the closer he looked. After several months, his final analysis identified that funds worth almost $1 million today had been diverted to prop up the business. Shaw was immediately ordered to sell Maritime Wireless, repay the mission accounts with interest, and return to the life of an ordinary priest. However, the wartime environment made it difficult to secure a reasonable price for the factory that was necessary to repay his creditors. The sale took 2 years to complete. In the meantime, there was a fall-off in work coming in. The government imposed heavy restrictions on the use of wireless during the war. The directors of the wireless works reluctantly accepted a 6-month contract to make munitions for the Australian infantry forces, just to keep the business afloat. A better price would be achieved if the workshops were sold as a going concern. 18-pounder shells were manufactured during this time, and the suburban factory was under guard by the militia. The shells were destined for the Western Front. The irony of this was anathema to some investors, to most church folk, and especially to Hubert Lincolns, who was an unwitting creditor. The shells made at the Randwick factory were destined to kill his own countrymen.
So there would have been a lot of tension and a lot of I couldn't imagine what was going on between the two of them at the time. That a very paradoxical situation and a very tense situation.
The process of selling the business had been tortuous for both Shaw and his overseer Lincolns. Preoccupied by business concerns, Shaw grew to have no interest in his priestly ministry and found solace in the company of Evie Hode, a vivacious woman 17 years his junior.
She was passionate. She was passionate about living life to its fullest. She lived it as though there was no tomorrow, and she lived it all today. And she was just so different and such a happy soul.
On multiple occasions, he had proposed marriage and promised her a new life in America once he had sold the business and left the priesthood.
As far as I can see, the relationship would have been made in heaven. It was just characterised the way they both were.
Lincolns got wind of Shaw's illicit relationship through a blackmail attempt made by one of Maritime Wireless's long-serving employees, who had been accused of theft. In order to have his charges dropped, the accused thief presented Lincolns with stories of a wayward Shaw and was threatening to take these stories to the press, creating a scandal for both Maritime Wireless and the missionaries of the Sacred Heart. Supporting his story, he presented Lincolns with compromising photographs he had acquired. The pictures were found in a drawer in the library at Archibald and were removed by the accused. The library was accessible to anyone who lived there or visited the house. The graphic photographs showed an unclothed Shaw with an unclothed Evie and another naked woman. Lincolns was able to negotiate a truce of sorts between the thief and Shaw to avoid a public scandal. He requested that the photographs be destroyed, but was never sure that they were. Events were closing in on Father Shaw, and his expiry date was fast approaching. Following an uncomfortable meeting with Lincolns on June the 8th, 1916, he penned a single sentence which served as a statement of his resignation.
Very Reverend Father, I ask you to obtain for me the remission of my vows for reasons known to yourself. Yours in Jesus Christ, Archibald Shaw.
Shaw then packed his bags and immediately caught the next train to Melbourne to escape a scheduled meeting with the apostolic delegate Bonaventura Ceretti, the Pope's Australian representative, who would formalise his defrocking.
Under the circumstances, not only do I support his request for the remission of his vows of poverty and obedience, but ask further, Your Excellency, to give him a secularization as complete and extensive as possible.
Well, I had a little talk with Jesus, told him things that just weren't
In 1916, Melbourne was the seat of Australian government. Shaw spent the next couple of months in negotiations, finalising the sale of Maritime Wireless to the Department of Navy, planning the next phase of his life with Evie, and keeping out of Lincoln's way. Publicly leaving the priesthood in a cloud of scandal immediately before the sale would have seriously compromised the value of the business.
Shaw now treated himself as a free agent, that he'd effectively left the order and he'd reverted to being an ordinary citizen rather than a priest.
The Australian Navy had always been the most logical buyer of the wireless works, particularly in the wartime environment. They expressed an interest in purchasing the business for its engineering capability as much as its capacity for wireless manufacture.
This week, Father Shaw announced by telegram that at last the sale of the wireless works has been finalized, and that in about 10 days or so, I should have a check for the part owing to us. That is, a proportion which will be a little more than a third of the sum that he has embezzled. I will believe it when I hold the check and say, better something than nothing. Later then will come the question of Father Shaw himself.
The sale of the business was not easy. It came about through the influence of Senator James Long, who lobbied the government on Shaw's behalf.
Shaw was friends with a Senator Long from Tasmania. His son worked in the wireless works. They used to go to races together in Melbourne, because the government was operating out of Melbourne at that time, just before Canberra existed.
Long was the senator for Tasmania and the father of an apprentice at Maritime Wireless. He was also a friend of Shaw. He greased the wheels of government and maximised the sale price.
The Sun newspaper published countless letters condemning the government purchasing the wireless works.
The two homes, factory buildings and land, plant and stock were all bought by the Navy under a questionable valuation.
When the Royal Commission on Hugh Dennison was called to give evidence, he was the chairman of AWA. His newspapers, The Sun, had railed against the sale of the wireless works. So Hugh Dennison was the cause of some of the findings about the valuation of the wireless works. His wireless works were worth £2,000, according to him. Yeah, and he had no editorial influence over the Sun newspaper and what they wrote, much like Rupert Murdoch has no editorial influence over what his newspapers publish.
The sale was approved quickly by the Minister for Navy, Gus Jensen, whilst Billy Hughes, the incumbent Prime Minister, was overseas. All this came at a price. After the sale was signed off by Minister Jensen, Shaw visited Senator Long at Parliament House in Melbourne, carrying £5,300 in cash, about $650,000 in today's money. The money was passed over to Long and was distributed between a handful of politicians who had assisted in the sale. Just who these politicians were remained largely speculation. In the end, the money could only be partially accounted for. Long's bank account showed an unusual cash deposit for £2,400 around this time. Both Senator Long and Minister Jensen subsequently lost their jobs because of the findings of a 1918 Royal Commission held into the circumstances of the government purchase.
The only person that had any representation before that Royal Commission on the sale of the works, it was bought by Jensen, the Minister of the Navy, was Jensen himself. None of the other people who gave evidence before that Royal Commission had any legal representation at all.
Where the balance of the graft payments ended up, some £2,900, was an enduring mystery and the focus of much speculation. The Royal Commission made a crude attempt to intimidate Evie Hode, Shaw's fiancée, who was called upon as one of many witnesses.
Evie Hode was characterised in the Royal Commission of 1918 almost as some sort of harlot.
The Crown prosecutor subjected her to an aggressive and irrelevant line of questioning in a blatant attempt to destroy her character. His logic assumed that if Evie admitted to having sexual relations with a priest, then she must surely be complicit in knowing where the missing money was.
Your relations were of the utmost intimacy, were they not?
What do you mean by that?
Sexual intercourse took place between you.
No.
Never?
No.
Do you swear that?
Yes, I went there to see him many times at his house.
Do you swear that sexual intercourse never took place between you and Father Shaw?
Yes, I do.
You used to visit him at his house?
Yes, very often.
Alone?
Sometimes alone and sometimes with my sister.
I see her as an innocent victim in all of this. I don't think she was particularly involved, but she probably had a working understanding of the relationships that Shaw was managing. But she certainly wasn't involved in any fraud or any financial transactions that Shaw may have conducted.
When the sale was finalised, Shaw planned to return to Sydney by steam train the following evening. He had cheques made out to repay his creditors and the missionaries of the Sacred Heart for an amount Lincoln's agreed to. Father Shaw then took the opportunity on his last night in Melbourne to celebrate with an old friend and two women whom the police would later identify as prostitutes. The four were in Shaw's room at the Melbourne Coffee Palace. There he suddenly and unexpectedly collapsed and became unconscious. He was taken to a nearby private hospital and died 5 days later. In those days, autopsies were not conducted on priests. The cause of his death was identified by the attending physician as chronic nephritis, cerebral hemorrhage, indefinite. Entertaining the possibility of a suspicious death, a police investigation into Shaw's friend and the two prostitutes who were with him cleared them all from involvement in murder and the theft of the missing money. Shaw's body was returned to Sydney by train, and a large funeral was held at Our Lady of the Sacred Heart Church, a short distance from the Maritime wireless factory. He was buried as a priest in Randwick Cemetery because his laicization had not been formalised. Few would have known of his desire to leave the priesthood and create a new life with Evie. In fact, Evie only found out about Shaw's death from a newspaper clipping sent to her by a friend.
Oh, she would have been broken-hearted, I'm sure, for a while, but such was her nature that she would have been moving on.
The cheque Shaw carried, destined to repay the mission accounts, was now withheld from Lincoln's and became part of Shaw's estate.
I will believe it when I hold the check and say, better something than nothing.
Shaw did not leave a will despite assurances to Lincoln's that he'd done so. In fact, Father Shaw kept Lincoln's in the dark with many things connected to his business. He only learnt of his wider interests when a statement of assets and liabilities was compiled after Shaw's death. To his credit, Lincoln's jostled persistently for several years with a long list of creditors, and eventually recovered nearly all the money the order was owed. Under the Navy, the Maritime wireless site became a repatriation school in electrical and engineering trades for soldiers returning from World War I. In 1923, it was taken over by the Royal Australian Air Force. A series of novel biplanes were designed and constructed under the leadership of squadron leader Lawrence Wackett during this time, and cohorts of aviation mechanics were trained in the workshops. By 1930, the Air Force moved from the site, and a few years later, the the large wireless mast erected by Kirkby and his men was dismantled. The site then became a suburban military depot and barracks for the local Citizens Military Force, later known as the Army Reserve. In the late 1990s, the Department of Defence sold the entire site to a developer. The original old workshops were demolished and replaced by some 42 brick dwellings that were sold to the public.
At some time or other, it became one of those little suburban army depots operating out of Randwick, and it was like that till about the turn of the century. The Royal Commission in 1918, when they gave their report in December 1918, recommended the works to be disposed of and sold, as it wasn't a suitable site for a manufacturing facility for anyone in the middle of Randwick, which was probably quite right too. The recommendation that it be sold was made in 1918, and it wasn't until 2000, around 2000, they eventually were sold. So they acted on the findings of the Royal Commission really promptly, didn't they?
Heritage orders were placed on Ascot and Archina. These homes can still be seen today on Dewtruck and Avoca streets. In 1947, Shaw's remains were moved from Randwick Cemetery to the missionaries of the Sacred Heart Cemetery at Douglas Park. History has a way of burying the past, and over the decades, Shaw's unlikely story was never fully told. Perhaps because of its scandalous nature, or perhaps through simple ignorance. Without the evidence recorded in the Royal Commission testimony of 1918, much detail concerning both Shaw and Maritime Wireless would be forever lost. Similarly, had Shaw undergone a formal expulsion from the priesthood before his death, the missionaries of the Sacred Heart would have had no reason to keep archival material on him. Little, if anything, would be known about Shaw the man and the business he founded. Shaw's headstone today carries the legacy of our ignorance. The only correct date inscribed is the date of his death.
I think whilst he started with the best intentions, I think his exit plan was more about re-establishing his life off the back of the wireless works. So if you look at Archibald Shaw in 1900 and you look at Archibald Shaw in 1915-16, I think his motivation's quite different.
The tension and I suppose the angst, the worry and the pressure of all of that having to fold up the factory and all the disaster and the controversy of the money and the funding and all of that could quite simply have broken the man. And whether you call it nervous breakdown or whatever, he just ran out of steam and ran out of vision possibly and just said, enough, I've just got to go.
Now all but forgotten, the story of the Maritime Wireless Telegraph Company is an important one in Australia's manufacturing heritage. It stood proudly as the first wireless manufacturing factory in the early days of Australian industry. It successfully competed against the behemoths of the time, the well-established English Marconi and German Telefunken companies. Trapped in institutional religious life by circumstance, Father Shaw's personal agonies and his unconventional life played out his strengths and weaknesses in full view, making his character, his accomplishments, and his legacy profoundly interesting. The Maritime Wireless Telegraph Company attracted creative, talented and eccentric engineers from all corners of the globe. They were drawn inexorably to work under the mantle of Father Archibald Shaw, the talented and enigmatic wireless priest.
His ability was actually to bring people together, to be able to market products, and to build relationships, particularly in government. Is he a crook? No, but I think he had a very specific skill set.
The Catholic Church shouldn't get involved in building wireless works. It wasn't in the interests of AWA to promote any other view than FIST turned up in 1911 and created the industry. So the whole shaping of the history is quite distorted. That's kind of why it's good to tell an alternative story and say, look, there's lots of people contributed to this, so don't forget who they are.
You know me as a rough man, but my intentions were always for the welfare of our order. I hate fighting and wrangling and wish to live in peace with all.
We hold his memory dear and we honour him for what he did and the person he was. So he's one of us. He's one of our brothers.